Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video, we're going to be continuing our read-along of Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger by Louis Sachar. And again, this is the third book of a 3-book series of the Wayside School series. But I hope you guys have been enjoying the read-aloud so far. Today we're going to be starting with Chapter 5. And again, I'll be showing you any illustrations that we come across. But let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 5, A Story with a Disappointing Ending. Paul's father was a security guard at a museum. The museum had a very famous painting. It was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. It was called the Mona Lisa. Next to the painting was a sign, "Do not touch." All day, Paul's father made sure nobody touched the painting. At night, after the museum closed, Paul's father was alone. Just him and the Mona Lisa. And the sign, "Do not touch. Do not touch. Do not." He was dying to touch it. The tips of his fingers tingled with desire. But this story isn't about Paul's father. It's about Paul. Paul was a student in Mrs. Jewell's class. He sat behind Leslie. Leslie had 2 long brown pigtails that reached down to her waist. They just hung there all day, right in front of Paul's face. The Mona Leslie. Do not touch. Do not touch. Do not. Paul reached out, grabbed, and yanked. "Yeah!" screamed Leslie. Mrs. Jewell sent Paul to the counselor's office. The counselor's office was on the 4th floor. Paul had never been there before. Like every student in Wayside School, he was afraid of the counselor. The counselor had a very scary face, with big, bushy eyebrows and a little beard on his pointed chin. Paul knocked on the door. "Come in," said the counselor. Paul entered and sat down on the couch. "What's the problem?" asked the counselor. "I pulled Leslie's pigtails again," said Paul. "I know it's wrong, but I just can't help myself." "Watch the pickle," said the counselor. Paul's eyes went back and forth as he stared at the swaying pickle. "You are getting sleepy," said the counselor. "Your eyelids are getting heavy." Paul suddenly felt very tired. He could hardly keep his eyes open. "When I count to 3, said the counselor, "you will fall into a deep, deep sleep. 1, 2, 3. Paul closed his eyes. He wasn't exactly asleep. He felt like he was living in a dream, but it was a very pleasant dream. He felt happy and safe. "Can you hear me?" asked the counselor. "Yes," said Paul. He was no longer afraid of the counselor. In fact, he liked him a lot. "You will do what I say," said the counselor. "I will do what you say," Paul repeated. "I am going to count to 5, said the counselor, "and then you will wake up. You will return to your classroom. You will take your seat behind Leslie. You will want to pull one of her pigtails, but when you reach for it, it will turn into a rattlesnake." "Leslie's pigtails are rattlesnakes," said Paul. "Very good," said the counselor. "Now just one more thing." He rubbed his beard and smiled. "When Leslie says the word pencil, her ears will turn into candy. The most delicious candy in the world. The candy of your dreams." Paul licked his lips. He could almost taste the rich chocolate and chewy caramel. "And you will try to eat the candy." "When Leslie says pencil, I will eat her ears," said Paul. The counselor counted to 5. Paul's eyes blinked open. "You may go back to class now," said the counselor. "I'm not in trouble?" asked Paul. "No," said the counselor. Paul shrugged. He returned to class. As he passed Leslie, he stuck out her tongue at him. She stuck out her tongue at him. He sat down behind her. "What'd the counselor do to you?" asked Eric Fry. Nothing, said Paul. He's a nice man. He looked at Leslie's pigtails. He had pulled the one on the left, but he still wanted to pull the one on the right. He lunged for it. It hissed at him. Its tail rattled. He screamed and fell back over in his chair. Everyone laughed. Paul, are you all right? Asked Mrs. Jules. I guess so, said Paul, getting back up. He didn't feel like pulling Leslie's pigtails anymore. It was just sort of a while later that Leslie's pencil point broke. Oh, great, she complained. What's the matter? Asked Jenny, who sat next to Leslie. Leslie showed her the broken pencil point. You want to borrow mine? Asked Eric Fry, who sat behind Jenny. No, I'll just go sharpen it, said Leslie. She went to the back of the room and sharpened her pencil. She returned to her seat. She set the pencil down on her desk, but it rolled off when she sat down. Hey, where'd it go? She asked, turning around. Where'd what go? Asked Paul. There it is, said Jenny, under Paul's desk. What's under my desk? Asked Paul. I'll get it, said Eric Fry. He reached under Paul's desk, picked up the pencil, and handed it to Leslie. She thanked him, and everyone returned to work. Chapter 6. Pet Day. All the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class brought a pet to school. The room was very noisy. Dogs barked, cats meowed, a frog croaked, a pig squealed, a cow mooed, birds tweeted. Mrs. Jewell held up 2 fingers. All the animals became quiet. Stephen didn't have a pet, so he brought an orange. He kept it in a cage on his desk so it couldn't escape. Todd brought Ralphie, his baby brother. Todd, said Mrs. Jewell. Todd barked. You cannot have a pet human, said Mrs. Jewell. He doesn't bite, Todd assured her. Joy told Todd to sit and be quiet. Mrs. Jewell got a large piece of poster board from the supply closet. Let's make a chart, she said. Across the top of her chart she wrote, name of kid, kind of pet, name of pet. She started with Dee Dee. She wrote Dee Dee under the name of kid. And you have a dog, she said. Cat, said Dee Dee. Cat, said Mrs. Jewell. Dee Dee nodded as she petted her dog. Mrs. Jewell moved on to Ron. Ron, I see you have a cat. Dog, said Ron, as he stroked the cat on his lap. Mrs. Jewell shrugged. Okay, she said. He's my dog, said DJ. Ron has your dog? Asked Mrs. Jewell. Ron has a cat, said DJ. That's what I thought, said Mrs. Jewell. But what's a dog? Said Jenny. Mrs. Jewell covered her ears and shook her head. Let's start all over again, said Mrs. Jewell. She got a new piece of poster board from the supply closet. Mac, what's your dog's name? What's my dog's name? Said Jenny. I'm not talking to you, Jenny. I'm talking to Mac. He can't talk, said Mac. Who can't talk? Asked Mrs. Jewell. Mac, said Mac. Billy barked at Mac. Mac barked at Billy. Todd barked at both of them. Joy made Todd lie down by her feet. Mrs. Jewell moved on. What's your pet, Myron? She asked. Your pet's a turtle, said Sherry. What? Asked Mrs. Jewell. What is Jenny's pet? Said Sherry. Jenny's pet is a dog, said Mrs. Jewell. What's his name, Jenny? Jenny nodded. Her dog sat up straight and tall and seemed to smile at Mrs. Jewell. He's handsome, said Mrs. Jewell. My mouse is handsome, said Benjamin. Benjamin had a little white mouse in a cage on his desk. If you like mice, said Dana, making a face. Mrs. Jewell likes mice, said Calvin. She eats them. Gross, said Dana. He won't come when you call him, said Kathy. He doesn't know his name. Billy meowed. Will Mrs. Jules eat yogurt? Asked John. No way, said Calvin. I will too, said Mrs. Jules. I like yogurt. I like strawberry best. Mauricia beamed. Mrs. Jules likes strawberries best, she bragged. You shouldn't pick favorites, complained Dana. Do you like crackers, Mrs. Jules? Asked Rondi. Don't worry, said Calvin. Mrs. Jules won't eat crackers. How do you know what I'll eat, Calvin? Asked Mrs. Jules, a little annoyed. I like eating crackers with cheese on top. Oh, gross, said Myron. He won't come when you call him, Kathy said again. Mac, keep Mac away from my socks, shouted Allison. Wait, said Jason. Now you've got my socks, and I've got your socks. I can tell the difference between my socks and your socks, Jason, said Allison. Mrs. Jules covered her ears and shook her head. She moved on. What's your pet, Damien? She asked. I already told you he was a turtle, said Sherry. I wasn't talking to you, Sherry, said Mrs. Jules. I was talking to Damien. Your nose a ferret, said Damien. My nose a ferret? Asked Mrs. Jules. My nose a hamster, said Joe. Billy bleated. Mrs. Jules licked her leg. Hey, Paul, said Leslie, I like your pigtails. Thanks, said Paul. May I touch your pajamas? Go ahead, said Bibi, who was already petting Leslie's pajamas. She won't scratch you. This is crazy, shouted Terrence. He's cute, said Dana. So to kind of bring a little bit more clarity, they wrote a chart of who everybody's name, animal, and kind of pet. So Dee Dee has a dog that's named Cat. Ron has a cat named Dog. DJ has a dog named OK. Jenny has a dog named What. Mac has a dog named Mac. Joy has a dog named Todd. Sherry has a turtle named Your Pet. Benjamin has a mouse called Handsome. Calvin has a cat called Mrs. Jules. Kathy has a skunk named Gross. John has a frog named Yogurt. Mauricia has a cat named Strawberry. Rondi has a bird named Crackers. Myron has a chipmunk named Cheese. Allison has a cat named Socks. And Jason has a cat named Socks. Damien has a ferret named Yorno. Joe has a hamster named Mino. Paul has a pig named Tails. Leslie has a cat named Pajamas. Terrence has a dog named Crazy. Eric Fry has a goat, named Billy. Eric Bacon has a dog named Billy. And Eric Ovens has a cat named Billy. Dana has a dog named Pugsy. Bibi has a bird named Picasso. Todd has a human kid as a pet, named Ralphie. And Stefan has an orange named Fido. Chapter 7, A Bad Word. Early in the morning, a white limousine drove up to Wayside School. Just like always, the chauffeur got out of the car, then opened the passenger door. Just like always. Mr. Kidswatter stepped out of the car. Thank you, James, he said. My name is David, said the chauffeur. Just like always. Mr. Kidswatter entered the school building. Good morning, Mr. Kidswatter, said Mrs. Day, the school secretary. She handed him a cup of hot coffee. Just like always. Thank you, Miss Knight, said Mr. Kidswatter. He walked into his office. Except his office door was closed. He smashed into it, spilling coffee all over his green suit. Who closed my door? He demanded. Why didn't you just open it? Asked Mrs. Day. "It's always open in the morning," said Mr. Kidswatter. "How was I supposed to know it was closed this time?" Up on the 30th story, Mrs. Jules took roll. Todd was absent. "Oh dear, I hope Todd is all right," said Mrs. Jules. "Todd's never all right," said Joy. She and Mauricia laughed. Damien looked at Mrs. Jules. Ever since he returned to Wayside School, he thought there was something different about her, but he still couldn't figure out what it was. Mr. Kidswatter's voice came over the PA system. "Good morning, boys and girls." There was the usual pause. "Today I want to talk about doors," said Mr. Kidswatter. "This should be interesting," said Mrs. Jules. "Do you know how many doors there are in this school building?" asked Mr. Kidswatter. Mrs. Jules shook her head. "Well, there are a lot. Over 30. And some of you probably have doors at home too. Maybe more than one. All those doors. Think about it." "Well, Mr. Kidswatter has certainly given us something to think about this morning," said Mrs. Jules. "So remember," said Mr. Kidswatter, "and please be careful. Always check to see if a door is open before going through it. And if it's not open, open it. If you can't open it yourself, ask someone to open it for you. This may not make a lot of sense to you now, but someday you'll thank me." Mrs. Jules looked around the class. "That's good advice," she said. "I think most of you already knew it, but at least it's nice to know we have a principal who cares." "I hate doors," shouted Mr. Kidswatter. "It's a dumb word. Door, door, door. Who made up that word anyway?" Mrs. Jules waited a little longer, but Mr. Kidswatter seemed to be finished. "Some people just don't like doors," she said. "I have made a new rule," declared Mr. Kidswatter. "You may no longer say that word. You know what word I mean, but don't say it. Instead, I have made up a new word for you. Guzak. Open the Guzak. Shut the Guzak. Lock the Guzak. Don't you think that's a better word? I do. From now on, the other word is a bad word. I have made my decision." Everyone turned around and looked at the Guzak. Suddenly, it opened. Todd entered. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said. "That's okay," said Mrs. Jules. "I'm just glad you're not sick or hurt." "My dad locked his keys in the car," Todd explained. "We had to use the coat hanger to unlock the door." Everyone gasped. Mrs. Jules made Todd write his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Chapter 8. Santa Claus. 'Twas the last day of school before winter vacation, and the children were having a small celebration. Their artwork was hung by the blackboards with pride, snowmen and mooses, and a joyful sleigh ride. They ate homemade cookies, red and green ones of course, when Kathy declared, "I don't believe in Santa Claus." She just opened her mouth and said what she said. Santa Claus isn't real, and besides that, he's dead. "So you bet I will pout, and you bet I will cry, you bet I will shout, I'm telling you why." Stephen covered his ears. "No, you're wrong," he shouted. "It's not true. There is a Santa Claus. I know there is." "Ho, ho, ho," laughed Kathy. "Kathy's just saying that because she never gets any presents," said Jason. "All she ever gets is a lump of coal," said Rondi. "Wrong," said Kathy. "I get lots of presents. My parents buy them for me. They have lots of money. They buy me anything I want." She bit off the head of a reindeer cookie. "The only thing that matters is how rich your parents are. If they have lots of money, then you'll get lots of good presents. If they're poor, then you'll just get a few crummy presents." Everyone tried to argue with her, but Kathy just asked them all the old questions, like, how does a fat man fit down a skinny chimney? Or, how could he visit everyone's house in the whole world in one night? And of course, nobody knew the answers. Nobody ever has. Only Santa knows the answers to those questions, said Rondi. Don't you even like Christmas? Asked Stefan. Sure, said Kathy. I get lots of presents, and I don't have to work. Then she stuck out her tongue and called Stefan a jerk. Poor Stefan sputtered, as his face turned quite blue. If you don't believe in Santa, he won't believe in you. But Kathy just yelped, You know that it's true. Do you still believe in the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Miss Zarves too? Let's ask Mrs. Jules, said Mauricia. She's a teacher who's wise. Let's ask Mrs. Jules. She never lies. The children crowded round their wise teacher's desk and asked her the question never found on a test. Is there a Santa? You're a teacher with smarts. Is Santa Claus real? They asked with pure hearts. And oh, Mrs. Jules, that teacher so wise, looked at their faces and bright eager eyes. She had to say something. It was her job to reply. Tell them, yelped Kathy, that reindeer can't fly. Outside the window, snowflakes were falling. Inside the window, Mrs. Jules was stalling. Are our parents all liars? Is it all just a trick to make us be good for fear of Saint Nick? Tell us the truth. Don't try to fake it. Is there a Santa? Let us know. We can take it. Mrs. Jules cleared her throat. Then she cleared it again. She put down her pencil. She picked up her pen. Hey, look! Shouted Leslie. Look there! Who's that? Someone is coming in through the guzak. Sure enough, the door opened. It had to open quite wide, as a stranger-looking stranger stepped sideways inside. He wore a red suit and had a white fluffy beard, and even for Wayside, he looked pretty weird. His fat belly shook like a bowl full of jello. There was no doubt about it. They knew that fellow. It was Louis, the yard teacher. What are you doing in that stupid suit, Louis? Asked Sherry. Aren't you hot? Why are you wearing a fake beard? Asked Todd. Is that pillow under your jacket? Asked Jason. Kathy was delighted. See, she said, that proves there's no Santa Claus. If there was, Louis wouldn't have to dress up like a fool and pretend to be him. I'm not Louis, said Louis. I'm Santa Claus. Ho, ho. You're lying to us, Louis, said John. Everyone is always lying to us. Kathy's right. Christmas is nothing but a dirty, stinking lie. I was just trying to bring a little holiday cheer, said Louis. Go home, Jerome, said Terence. Now, that's no way to talk to Louis, said Mrs. Jules. Louis is one of Santa's special helpers. Really, Louis? Asked Dee Dee. Louis looked at Mrs. Jules. That's right, he said. The children were all very impressed. Have you ever met him? Demanded Kathy. Well, no, not exactly, Louis admitted. See, said Kathy, it's just another lie. You don't have to meet Santa to be one of his special helpers, said Mrs. Jules. Then how do you know what he wants you to do? Asked John. That's easy, said Mrs. Jules. You just have to be nice to other people. Whenever you give someone a present or sing a holiday song, you're helping Santa Claus. To me, that's what Christmas is all about, helping Santa Claus. Can I be one of his helpers? Asked Damien. You bet, said Mrs. Jules. Hey, everybody, shouted Damien. I'm one of Santa's helpers. Me too, said Allison. There must be a Santa Claus, cheered Stefan, because it feels so good to help him. So the children all helped Santa in every way they could, by singing songs and giving gifts, and just by being good. But there is no Santa Claus, Kathy continued to yelp. Well, if that's the case, said Mrs. Jules, he must really need our help. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 8. But I hope you guys enjoyed the read aloud today, and I hope to see you guys next time in our continuation of Wayside School Gets a Little Stranger. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Please take good care and be safe. Bye.